People aren't our enemy. Ignorance is our enemy. Until we get this lesson, we will not have a loving and just society that takes care of everyone. I sometimes think about one of my dearest friends in this life who died a couple of years ago. This is my friend Kelly LaRue, who I met when I was 16 and living in an ashram, where I went to learn meditation and basically to become enlightened. Still a work in progress, of course. Kelly is the one who taught me how to use my natural, God-given psychic abilities that you also have, whether you know it or not. And he was one of my closest friends for decades, even after we both left the ashram. We still spoke on the phone a few times every week, and he was always this incredibly generous source of feedback and advice, which he got through his psychic perception often. And he was just an incredible friend. But he had a very sad life, I would say. And I often think about him and wonder what his life would have been like if back in the 50s when he was growing up, if his parents hadn't been taught that parenting method where you leave your infant child crying in another room, sometimes for hours, until they eventually stop from exhaustion and hopelessness that anyone's gonna come. What would his life have been like if his trust in other people hadn't been shattered by that kind of childhood, making it hard for him to form secure relationships with people as an adult? I wonder what his life would have been like in the later years if, when he lived in the ashram, he hadn't been publicly humiliated in a personal growth course that was being given there, which was mandatory for ashram staff, where my friend Kelly was singled out in a crowd of maybe 500 people and told to stand up and then berated in front of everybody. All of his coworkers, all of his friends, everybody who was staff at the ashram watched him get humiliated by a manager who said to him that he was the worst worker in the ashram, and other deeply humiliating things to which Kelly could not respond. He could not defend himself or speak back to this manager because that just really wasn't allowed in the ashram. If you did that, you were told that you had a bad attitude and you needed to leave. Plus, it's confusing. It was very confusing because everyone in that course was told that the manager berating them was doing this by sort of divine right, that he was speaking for the gurus of the lineage, and therefore talking back was not an option. So my friend stood there helplessly as he was humiliated. And when he left the ashram shortly after that, and our relationship continued by these many weekly phone calls that we had, I saw how deeply damaged he was by that incident. He was struggling to process the emotional pain that came out of that incident for years after that. Struggling and not succeeding. I wonder what his life would have been like if that hadn't happened to him. And I wonder what his life would have been like later if he hadn't gone to a therapist who prescribed him a cornucopia of pharmaceutical drugs and told him that he had multiple personality disorder. My friend Kelly was psychic, very psychic, so naturally a psychic is going to be very aware of his internal parts. In the modern internal family system model, which is a hugely popular and widely accepted model of therapy, we all have individual parts to our personalities that function like individual persons, almost. So Kelly was very aware of his inner parts, but the therapist he went to at the Veterans Medical Center was not aware of this, and she diagnosed him as multiple personality disorder and prescribed him one pharmaceutical drug after another. And for the following 10 years, I watched my friend's mind become more and more chaotic until I didn't recognize my friend at all. Then Kelly lost his business because he could barely function, and he had to flee town owing money to other people and take refuge with his own daughter, who fortunately knew how to nurse him back to health by getting him off the drugs that were being prescribed to him. And as he got off those drugs, on phone calls I had with him, I watched my friend's personality slowly come back. I wonder who my friend would have been if that therapist hadn't given him a bad diagnosis and damaging drugs that completely imbalanced his mind and caused him his entire life to fall apart. Who would my friend have been? And who would he have been once he recovered and he tried to start dating, but he found that, yeah, I guess I'll say this, it's very intimate, but this kind of thing needs to get talked about. Kelly tried to date, but his body didn't perform as expected in bed, if you know what I mean. And Kelly didn't understand why that was happening, but it was kind of like the last straw for him attempting to have a close romantic partnership. Last I heard, he gave up on that idea. He decided there was something really wrong with him, and he just needed to give up on ever having a close, supportive, healthy relationship with a woman. I wonder how it would have been different if one of the doctors prescribing him those pharmaceutical drugs had told him that they wreak havoc on a man's ability to perform in bed, and that it can take years to recover, if you ever recover at all. How would he have responded to that situation if he had known that one simple fact? So if we look at my friend Kelly's life, the way his parents abandoned him to cry until he gave up on anyone ever coming, how he was mistreated in that course in the ashram and left wounded for years trying to recover, and how that therapist, in her ignorance, prescribed him these horrible drugs and misdiagnosed him, and how those drugs destroyed his mind for over a decade, and how even after he recovered, he was still having physical issues that caused him to give up on closeness with a woman. How would his life have been different if those things hadn't happened to him? I don't know, but it would have been a very different life. It would have been a much richer and happier life. My friend Kelly had amazing gifts. Imagine if his interpersonal, relational self hadn't been so deeply damaged by other people. And here's the point I'm driving at here. It's not to blame his parents or that manager in the ashram or the therapist or anyone else. Those people thought they were helping my friend when they did what they did. But they weren't. They were damaging him. When people hurt us, it's not because they are bad or they are an enemy. It's because they are ignorant and most likely very wounded themselves. People aren't our enemy. Ignorance is our enemy. Until we get this lesson, we will not have a loving and just society that takes care of everyone.